Late 1944. High above Germany, Allied bomber formations were pushing deeper into the heart of the Reich almost every day. Hundreds of B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators crossed the sky in tight defensive formations, while escort fighters such as the P-51 Mustang and P-47 Thunderbolt guarded them from German interception. By this stage of the war, Allied crews had become familiar with the tactics used by the Luftwaffe. German fighters would climb rapidly toward the bomber stream, make high-speed passes through the formation, and then break away before escort fighters could close in. The aircraft involved in these battles were fast and dangerous, but they all shared the same fundamental technology, propellers pulling them through the air. Then reports began spreading among bomber crews about a new German aircraft that behaved very differently in combat. Instead of approaching gradually like other fighters, the aircraft appeared suddenly, moving across the sky at a speed that seemed far beyond anything pilots had previously encountered. Gunners watching the horizon sometimes had only seconds to react before the aircraft flashed past the formation. The machine responsible for these encounters was the Messerschmitt Me 262, the world's first operational jet fighter. The Me 262 did not rely on propellers, like the fighters that had dominated aerial combat for decades. Instead, two jet engines mounted beneath its wings pushed the aircraft forward using a completely different form of propulsion. So this technology allowed the jet fighter to reach speeds significantly faster than most Allied aircraft flying at the time. For bomber crews accustomed to fighting conventional fighters, the sudden appearance of a jet aircraft created a new kind of challenge. The Me 262 could approach a bomber formation at extremely high speed, fire its powerful 30mm cannons, and then accelerate away before escort fighters could close the distance. In many encounters, the jet appeared and disappeared so quickly that some gunners struggled even to track it through their sights. The aircraft's performance shocked many Allied pilots the first time they encountered it in combat. Yet despite the fear and surprise created by this revolutionary machine, the Me 262 entered the war during its final stages. The aircraft represented a glimpse of the future of aviation, but it also arrived at a moment when the strategic balance of the war had already begun shifting decisively against Germany. By the time the Messerschmitt Me 262 began appearing in the skies over Germany, Allied pilots had already spent years fighting the Luftwaffe's most capable aircraft. Fighters such as the Messerschmitt Bf-109 and the Focke-Wulf FW-190 were well known to bomber crews and escort pilots alike. These aircraft were dangerous opponents, capable of climbing quickly and delivering powerful bursts of cannon fire against bomber formations. Yet, despite their effectiveness, the fundamental technology behind them remained familiar. They were propeller-driven fighters powered by piston engines, just like the aircraft flown by Allied pilots. Air combat between these machines followed patterns that had developed throughout the war. Interceptors climbed toward incoming bombers, escort fighters attempted to block their approach, and the battle unfolded through maneuvering, diving attacks, and close-range gunfire. By late 1944, Allied pilots believed they understood the strengths and limitations of German fighter aircraft, and their tactics were built around that experience. From the perspective of many Allied crews, the Luftwaffe still relied on aircraft that followed the same basic design principles as fighters used by every major air force during the war. Even when new versions of German fighters appeared, they generally represented improvements in speed, firepower, or maneuverability, rather than a complete change in technology. This familiarity allowed Allied pilots to develop strategies to counter them. Escort fighters learned how to intercept German attackers before they reached bomber formations, while bomber gunners practiced coordinated defensive fire to repel fighters that managed to break through the escort screen. The assumption underlying these tactics was that enemy aircraft would operate within the same performance limits as other propeller-driven fighters. When reports began circulating about a German aircraft capable of flying dramatically faster than anything else in the sky, many crews initially struggled to understand how such a machine could exist. The idea of a fighter that did not rely on a propeller seemed almost experimental compared with the aircraft that had dominated aerial combat for decades. Yet the first encounters with the Me-262 soon demonstrated that the familiar rules of air combat were about to be challenged by a completely different kind of aircraft technology. The Messerschmitt Me-262 represented a technological leap far beyond the propeller-driven fighters that had dominated aerial combat since the beginning of the war. Instead of relying on a piston engine turning a propeller, the aircraft used two turbojet engines mounted beneath its wings. These engines worked on a completely different principle. Rather than pulling the aircraft forward with spinning propeller blades, jet engines produced thrust by compressing air, mixing it with fuel, igniting the mixture, and expelling the hot gases out the back at high speed. This process pushed the aircraft forward with tremendous force and allowed the Me-262 to reach speeds that conventional fighters could not easily match. In level flight, the jet fighter could exceed 540 miles per hour, a speed that placed it well beyond the performance of most Allied piston engine fighters operating at the time. The aircraft's sleek, swept-wing design and streamlined fuselage helped reduce drag, allowing it to maintain this high speed while operating at the altitudes where bomber formations frequently flew. The Me-262 was not only fast, it was also heavily armed for the role it was expected to perform. German planners designed the aircraft primarily as an interceptor capable of attacking Allied bomber formations that were striking industrial targets across Germany. To accomplish this mission, the fighter carried four powerful 30mm Mk-108 cannons mounted in its nose. These weapons fired explosive shells capable of inflicting devastating damage on heavy bombers with only a few hits. In theory, a single short burst from the Me-262 could cripple or destroy a bomber that might otherwise require dozens of smaller caliber rounds. The aircraft's speed allowed it to approach a bomber formation quickly, fire its weapons, and then accelerate away before escort fighters could intercept it. On paper, this combination of speed and firepower made the Me-262 one of the most formidable aircraft introduced during the war. It represented the beginning of a new generation of fighter aircraft built around jet propulsion rather than propellers. Yet the success of such a revolutionary machine depended not only on engineering, but also on timing, production capacity, and the strategic situation surrounding its deployment. The first combat encounters with the Messerschmitt Me 262 quickly demonstrated how different jet-powered combat could be compared with the propeller-driven battles that had dominated the war until that point. Allied bomber crews flying over Germany began reporting brief and sudden attacks from aircraft that seemed to move through the sky with unusual speed. Instead of climbing gradually toward the bomber formations like traditional interceptors, the Me-262 often approached at high velocity, closing the distance far more quickly than expected. Gunners, scanning the sky for incoming fighters, sometimes had only seconds to react before the jet passed through the formation. The aircraft's speed allowed its pilots to choose the moment of engagement, strike quickly, and then accelerate away before escort fighters could intercept them. For bomber crews accustomed to fighting slower piston engine fighters, the experience felt dramatically different. The familiar rhythm of interception and defensive fire was suddenly disrupted by an aircraft capable of entering and leaving the battle with remarkable speed. When the Me-262 attacked bomber formations, its heavy armament added to the shock experienced by Allied crews. The fighter's four 30mm cannons fired explosive shells capable of inflicting serious damage with only a few hits. During some encounters, a jet pilot could approach the bomber stream, fire a short burst into a formation, and then break away before defensive gunners had time to adjust their aim. The speed of the aircraft made it difficult for escort fighters to pursue the jet once it began accelerating away from the engagement. Allied pilots flying aircraft such as the P-51 Mustang and P-47 Thunderbolt quickly realized that catching a Me-262 in level flight would be extremely difficult. Instead, they began observing when and where the jet fighters appeared, looking for patterns that might reveal weaknesses in the aircraft's operations. The first proof of the Me-262's capabilities, therefore, created two simultaneous reactions among Allied airmen. On one hand, the aircraft's speed and firepower demonstrated a dangerous new technology in the skies over Europe. On the other, the limited number of jets appearing in combat suggested that the revolutionary fighter had not yet been deployed in large enough numbers to fundamentally change the course of the air war. For the pilots who flew it, the Messerschmitt Me-262 represented both a remarkable technological breakthrough and a challenging aircraft to operate in combat conditions. Many of the Luftwaffe pilots selected to fly the jet fighter were already experienced aviators who had spent years flying propeller-driven aircraft such as the BF-109 or FW-190. Transitioning to the Me-262 required learning an entirely different type of machine. Jet engines responded more slowly than piston engines when pilots adjusted the throttle, meaning that sudden changes in power could take several seconds to produce results. This required pilots to think carefully about their speed and positioning during combat engagements. If a pilot attempted to accelerate too quickly, the engines could stall or become damaged. At the same time, the aircraft's high speed demanded precise control during takeoff and landing, phases of flight that proved particularly difficult for new jet pilots. Flying the Me-262 therefore required both skill and patience, as pilots adapted to the unique characteristics of early jet propulsion. Despite these challenges, pilots quickly recognized the advantages the aircraft provided once it reached the skies above the battlefield. In the air, the Me-262's speed allowed its pilots to control many aspects of the engagement. Instead of entering prolonged turning dogfights, jet pilots often used high-speed passes to attack bomber formations before climbing or diving away from the fight. This style of combat relied on speed rather than maneuverability, allowing the aircraft to take advantage of its greatest strength. The German pilots flying the Me-262 often described the experience as fundamentally different from flying piston engine fighters. The aircraft could close distance rapidly and strike bomber formations with powerful cannon fire before enemy fighters had time to react. Yet these advantages also came with limitations. Because the jet engines required careful handling and time to respond, pilots had to plan their attacks carefully and avoid situations where the aircraft might lose speed or become vulnerable. The human experience of flying the Me-262 therefore reflected both sides of the aircraft's revolutionary design. Extraordinary speed combined with the operational challenges of early jet technology. The appearance of the Messerschmitt Me 262 marked the first time jet aircraft had entered combat in significant numbers, and its arrival hinted at how the future of air warfare might develop. For decades, fighter aircraft had been powered by piston engines driving propellers, and improvements in aviation had focused on refining that technology. Engineers worked to increase engine horsepower, reduce drag, and improve aerodynamic efficiency in order to gain small increases in speed and climb performance. The Me-262 represented a different approach entirely. By replacing the propeller with jet propulsion, the aircraft achieved speeds that pushed beyond the limits of most piston engine fighters. Now, this shift suggested that the next generation of combat aircraft would rely on an entirely new type of engine, rather than incremental improvements to existing designs. For observers on both sides of the war, the jet fighter signaled that aviation technology was entering a new phase. However, the strategic situation surrounding the aircraft limited the scale of its influence during the war itself. By the time the Me-262 began appearing in combat operations, Allied air forces had already gained a strong presence over Germany. Large bomber formations were striking industrial targets across the country, escorted by fighters capable of challenging German interceptors. At the same time, Allied bombing campaigns were targeting factories, transportation networks, and fuel production facilities that supported German aircraft manufacturing. These pressures made it difficult for Germany to deploy large numbers of the new jet fighter. While the Me 262 demonstrated extraordinary speed and represented a major technological development, it arrived during a period when the broader strategic balance of the air war had already shifted. The aircraft therefore became both a powerful weapon and a symbol of how rapidly aviation technology was evolving. Even though the jet fighter could not reverse the course of the war, its performance suggested that the future of aerial combat would be shaped by aircraft capable of flying far faster than the propeller-driven machines that had dominated the skies since the beginning of the conflict. As the Messerschmitt Me 262 entered combat service, German planners hoped the revolutionary jet fighter might slow the growing pressure created by Allied air operations. On paper, the aircraft's speed and firepower suggested it could become a formidable interceptor against the large bomber formations striking targets across Germany. However, transforming a new aircraft design into a weapon capable of influencing the wider war required more than technical innovation. It depended on production capacity, reliable engines, trained pilots, and a stable supply of fuel and spare parts. By the time the Me 262 began appearing in operational units, Germany was already facing severe industrial and logistical challenges. Allied bombing campaigns targeted aircraft factories, transportation systems, and fuel facilities that supported the German war effort. These attacks disrupted production and made it increasingly difficult to manufacture and deliver advanced aircraft in the numbers needed to alter the balance of air power. Although several squadrons eventually received the jet fighter, the total number of operational Me 262 aircraft remained relatively small compared with the massive scale of Allied aviation production. American and British factories were producing thousands of aircraft each month, equipping large numbers of bomber and fighter groups across Europe. In contrast, German industry struggled to maintain consistent output while dealing with shortages of materials and the effects of constant bombing. The jet engines used by the Me 262 also presented additional difficulties. Early jet technology required careful manufacturing and maintenance, and the engines often had shorter operational lifespans than piston engines used in conventional fighters. These factors limited how many aircraft could remain combat-ready at any given time. As a result, while the Me 262 demonstrated impressive performance in individual engagements, it never appeared in the overwhelming numbers required to challenge the scale of Allied air operations. The jet fighter represented a glimpse of the future of aviation, but the realities of wartime production meant that its presence in the skies remained limited compared with the vast fleets of propeller-driven aircraft dominating the battlefield. As Allied pilots gained more experience encountering the Messerschmitt Me 262, their understanding of the jet fighter gradually changed. The aircraft's extraordinary speed made it one of the most difficult opponents to intercept once it was airborne and moving at full power. Escort fighters, such as the P-51 Mustang and P-47 Thunderbolt, quickly discovered that chasing the jet in level flight was nearly impossible. The Me 262 could accelerate away from most piston-engine fighters, leaving them unable to close the distance before the jet escaped the battle area. This advantage forced Allied pilots to reconsider their tactics when dealing with the new aircraft. Instead of attempting to pursue the jet once it had already engaged bomber formations, fighter pilots began studying the patterns of its operations. They observed where the aircraft appeared, how it approached its targets, and when it was most vulnerable during a mission. Through these observations, Allied pilots discovered that the jet fighter's greatest weakness occurred during takeoff and landing. Unlike piston-engine aircraft, early jet engines required time to build thrust when the throttle was increased. This meant that the Me 262 could not accelerate quickly during the critical moments when it was climbing away from the runway or preparing to land. Allied fighter pilots began patrolling areas near known jet airfields, hoping to intercept the aircraft during these vulnerable stages of flight. These tactics gradually reduced some of the jet's advantage in speed. Although the Me-262 remained extremely dangerous once it reached altitude, its limited numbers and operational vulnerabilities prevented it from dominating the skies completely. Allied pilots learned that defeating the jet fighter did not require matching its speed in the air, but rather exploiting the moments when its advanced technology offered less protection. By adapting their tactics in response to the new aircraft, Allied air forces demonstrated how experience and strategy could counter even the most advanced machines introduced during the war. By the final months of World War II, the Messerschmitt Me 262 had proven that jet propulsion represented the future of military aviation. Its speed, heavy armament, and ability to strike bomber formations with sudden attacks demonstrated how dramatically air combat could change when aircraft were no longer limited by propeller-driven engines. In theory, a large force of jet fighters like the Me-262 could have posed a serious threat to the massive Allied bomber fleets operating over Europe. Yet the aircraft entered combat at a time when the strategic situation facing Germany had already become extremely difficult. Allied forces had gained control of large portions of European airspace, and bombing campaigns were steadily targeting the factories, rail networks, and fuel facilities that supported German aircraft production. These pressures meant that even advanced technology could not easily overcome the broader challenges facing the German war effort. The Me-262, therefore, became both a powerful weapon and a symbol of a technological breakthrough that arrived too late to change the outcome of the conflict. Although the jet fighter shocked Allied pilots during its early appearances and demonstrated remarkable speed in combat, it never appeared in sufficient numbers to reverse the balance of power in the skies. Instead, the aircraft revealed the direction aviation would take in the years after the war. Engineers and military planners around the world studied the lessons learned from the Me-262, recognizing that jet propulsion would soon replace piston engines in frontline fighter aircraft. In this way, the jet fighter's greatest impact may not have been the battles it fought during the war itself, but the future it foreshadowed. The aircraft showed that the age of propeller-driven fighters was coming to an end, and that the next generation of air combat would be fought by machines capable of far greater speed and performance. The Messerschmitt Me 262 had arrived as a revolutionary weapon, but history ultimately remembered it as the first glimpse of the jet-powered era that followed. The Messerschmitt Me 262 proved that jet technology could completely change the speed and power of fighter aircraft. For Allied pilots who first encountered it, the jet fighter was unlike anything they had faced before. Yet despite its revolutionary design, the aircraft arrived when the war was already turning against Germany, showing that even the most advanced technology cannot change history if it appears too late.